Hello and welcome to this edition of the Deep Dive Perspective. We've got an interesting topic as usual. It's the ID cards, it's digital surveillance. We're going to talk about the whole plethora of issues that are arising as what's known as Techno-Feudalism takes a grip. Not so long ago, if you raised any of these issues, you'd have been called a conspiracy theorist and you'd have been laughed out of the room. You'd want the tinfoil hat would have come out and you'd have been labelled. Not so easy to do that now, given that Keir Starmer has also made it clear that the BRIC card is on its way. What does that mean for you? What does it mean for me? How are we going to regulate the kind of intrusion to privacy that is clearly now possible with this kind of plan? And is it actually what he says, just a benign effort to make life much easier for you and to stop the immigrants? You know, we always need a reason. And of course, Starmer's main reason is that he's going to help you get rid of all the immigrants. Well, there's a lot of things to unpack there. And who better than the two guests I have to do it? Firstly, of course, my friend who's been on the show before, Tony Gosling, former BBC broadcaster, but now working as an independent in Bristol on his own channel, own podcast. I'll let him shout about that himself. And we've also got the inimitable Clive Menzies from Outer Sight. But both of these gentlemen have looked very closely at these kinds of issues over many, many years and have done some really important research. And now, of course, it's getting even more and more vital that we listen to these kinds of counter-narratives to what the likes of Mr. Starmer would have us believe. Welcome to the show, Tony.
Hi.
Nice of you to come, and welcome also, Clive. Good to see you.
Good to be here.
So let me kick off with you, Tony. British ID cards have been looming for a while. They've tried several times. The Tories, Badenoch says that she's not very interested in them. Farage has poo-pooed them. So it's not across the entire political spectrum that they want such a thing. But Starmer, who's a good friend of the World Economic Forum, was very keen, even when he first went, when he was not Prime Minister, when he went to Klaus Schwab and all his kind of entourage, was very keen to buy into everything that the World Economic Forum and Agenda 2030 and essentially techno-feudal capitalism wanted. Are we seeing him bending to that agenda here? Is this part of that?
Well, I don't think there's any need to bend somebody like Starmer. He just reads whatever script is put in front of him. I don't think he's really got any political convictions whatsoever. He's dropped all of his claims when he first became leader of the Labour Party, and he is just a chess piece being moved around by other players on the board. But worth saying, the Together Declaration just this past weekend organised a mass demonstration against ID cards in central London, which was carried on some of the news channels. So there is an immediate pushback. But a couple of things to say specifically about this proposal. Firstly, it was a press release. So it wasn't something which was discussed anywhere in any of the manifestos or in Parliament at all. It's just produced as something for the public to find out about through the press. Now, of course, this has annoyed a lot of MPs, particularly opposition MPs. It's just simply a one-page press release. This is what's happening. So nobody in Parliament knew anything much about it. Maybe some people in the cabinet did. So this is no way to make policy. Clearly, a few people sitting around a table writing a press release and then it going all out over the news. I, as a journalist, would make sure that was part of the story. To say, this is a press release we've just received. We can't find anybody in Parliament who will talk about it because they don't know about it. So this is the way policy is being made nowadays. The second thing to say, important thing, which I've been following for years, is this fascinating little book. It's called IBM and the Holocaust, and it's by Edwin Black, a US Jewish writer. And he explains that during the 1930s, IBM was in bed with the Nazis in Germany, where they were buying these holorith machines, which were punch card machines, where everybody in Germany and in occupied Europe eventually had to be registered with all their various characteristics. One, of course, was their ethnic origin. So when it came during the war after 1938 or so, where the SS were going around arresting Jews to either deport or put into concentration camps or whatever, they just pressed a button on the machine and out came these are the guys we arrest, this address and this address and this address, because they had all that information. And this, of course, was part of a profiling database. So this was a system of ethnic cleansing. And I think it's exactly what they're doing today, which is mass profiling through data robbery and stealing data from all sorts of areas. But that data is worth money. They want to know everything about everybody. Everybody's profiled quietly and secretly by the intelligence services and by multinational corporations. And finally, when I did my book, The Siege of Heaven Reader, which is really an anthology about secret government ever since the English Civil War, so there's a whole load of extracts to do with, I think it's, for me, it's just sharing with readers some concrete examples over the years, over the centuries, of secret government in operation. On the front cover is a picture of a little newborn baby with a yellow number cow tag in its ear. And I think this is where we're heading with this, is towards slavery. The idea that some official can come up to you in the street, show me your papers. It's exactly like a kind of wartime situation. The only thing is, we are the targets. The population, the public, are now the targets. In Britain, where our grandparents and some of us, our parents, thought they'd fought and beat the Nazis in the Second World War.
Fascinating stuff. But of course, Starmer and those who are in favour of the card would say that this is really going to help us in our fight against drugs, against crime, against immigrants who are taking, who are working illegally. There are obviously clear arguments because we have the NI card, of course, and we could argue, well, you couldn't get legal employment without an NI card. So just by having this card, why would anybody not be able to get sort of a job that is illegal?
Well, look, there's a couple of principles. One is you're innocent until proven guilty, aren't you? Or maybe they've quietly changed that. You're guilty until you can prove yourself innocent. Maybe that's what's been really going on behind the scenes. And also, of course, say, for example, illegal migrants coming across the channel. Are they going to have an ID card? No, of course they're not. And are people who are not allowed to work going to work cash in hand without, or in exchange for goods and services without permission? Of course they can. The black market would always find a way around this. So it's a completely bogus excuse. He's trying to ride on the coattails of Farage, with Farage's very popular idea that there's too much cheap labour being imported into Britain, and he's trying to use that as a way to say, that's why we're doing this. Of course it's not. Anyone with half a brain cell can see this is actually about social control. In fact, it's very similar to the sort of social credit system that there is over in China, that they've introduced in China. And it's quite funny, isn't it, that the British seem to be very friendly with the Chinese when it comes to getting them off rather awkward court cases to do with national security.
Well, I mean, all of this makes a lot of sense. Clive, I'm going to bring you in on the back of a quote that I picked up from civil liberty groups who have started raising concerns about the proposal. This one's from Silky Carlo, a wonderful name, that one, the director of Big Brother Watch. And the warning from that source is that this will make Britain less free and create a domestic mass surveillance infrastructure that'll likely sprawl from citizenship to benefits, tax, health, possibly even internet data and more. And it's basically her concern, or this Silky's concern, that incredibly sensitive information about each and every one of us will be hoarded by the state and vulnerable to cyber attacks. Exactly what Tony has outlined. What's your take on this, Clive? Where do you come in on the idea of IDs and what's actually happening practically here?
Well, I think we need to differentiate between a press release, which is a stated ambition, and it's not the only way that this has been sort of promoted throughout the media and academia and elsewhere. I think one needs to look at the reality. The reality is that we've been farmed for centuries. That effective control through the platforms that we use, through national insurance, through all the bits of identification that we have, driving licenses, passports, all the rest of it, we're already there in many respects because many of these things have digital interfaces. But the reality is that when you look at these overarching schemes to create a one database to rule them all, if you think back to the track and trace in the COVID psyop, they I think the word that Boris Johnson used was spaffed up the wall, 34 billion or such. So my take is that we're in the transition. We're going through a paradigm shift, and the system is now so desperate because they're trying to get ahead of the narrative curve, but they're also trying to bring out all the stops in terms of affecting their plan, which is one world government, a sort of mongrel species at the lower level and the elite at the top. But it's not going to work for a whole multitude of reasons, not least that IT projects are notorious for failing. There was an article in the last couple of days about one of the government departments or a contract captor, I think it was, have been fined for a whole mass of records that went into the public domain. So you've got that. And then you've got that people are actually beginning to realize that their governments are criminals. When you talk about, digital ID to stop crime or mass immigration or all of the bad things that are happening, the biggest perpetrators, drug running, people trafficking, all the rest of it, are governments, our government specifically. And so we're in this transitional period where there are those who will willingly sign up for this, possibly to be victims ultimately, but a growing proportion will resist, and the whole thing will fall over. The world is organized by money, and what is changing is that we are seeing a transition to the ways that we organize ourselves, and the more hostile and difficult it becomes to navigate the current system and interfaces with government, corporations, etc., the more that people will revert to how we've lived for millennia, which is basically in cooperation, collaboration with each other. And so I don't have any particular fear of digital ID because I just don't think they're going to realize their ambition. I don't really want to go back into IBM and the Holocaust because that is a narrative that needs to be exploded because there is no physical or documentary evidence of a mass killing machine. I would agree that the Nazis, along with the Americans and the British, were doing all sorts of nasty things in terms of eugenics and identifying what they described as sort of criminal genes or basically dysfunctional genes and trying to expunge the population. The eugenics movement has been behind a lot of this, the climate scam and everything else. So these are the ambitions, but they're coming so thick and fast. If you think that 9/11 was them overreaching themselves because it became apparent within not very long that it was a false flag, we're now actually seeing all of these narratives being exploded in real time or even in advance, because many people have been deconstructing these ideas for years. And technology is moving very fast. And for the technology that we have in terms of Amazon, Google, Facebook, Meta, Microsoft, etc., and Apple, basically they are having to distribute more and more of their processing, if you like, nearer to the point of impact, because as we've seen in the last couple of days, Amazon Web Services suffered a huge outage. The whole thing has to be distributed. So I don't fear digital ID. I think that the open source idea of development is where we're going, and we're going to open source value so that data will be important, but it won't be controlled by anyone. It'll be decentralized. So whatever their ambitions, they will come to naught. And there are all sorts of dark, fear-mongering stories that are primarily to frighten the human cattle. And I think the more we disassociate from the system, stop paying taxes, stop paying for all the things that belong to us, the quicker this is going to disintegrate and the smoother transition for everybody.
Well, there is a discernible resistance. I mean, there have been almost 3 million people on a parliamentary petition, for instance, that have pushed back against this idea. Clive obviously got a very optimistic take on the chances of success of this kind of surveillance. But there's an awful lot of money behind feudal capitalism, or techno-feudalism, as it were, and the likes of Elon Musk, Bezos, the Amazon as quoted, or Bill Gates, they are very busy. I mean, they're very busy trying to make sure this happens. That much money, that much power, that much political influence, because the government's teaming up with these massive corporate outfits, is a reality. Can it be resisted?
Well, in a way, we sort of already have digital ID through the use of our debit cards, credit cards, etc. But I think if you're looking at the tech giants and this idea of techno-feudalism, there's very much a drive towards depersonalizing society and decision-making. So what is AI about? Well, I see AI replacing... In fact, if you remember back in the 1990s, lots of jobs were being written out by software engineers. People are writing programs for a car factory that's making the workers in there redundant, and robots are doing the jobs, this sort of thing. Now, but with AI, you've even got the software engineers being written out of the story because the AI is writing the software now. And so it seems to me that as the elite, the techno-feudalists, are trying to move into all sorts of new areas of power, control and ownership and monopolizing, that what they're doing is they're extending their power maybe too far. As Clive's saying, maybe we don't have too much to worry about because they're going to be trying too hard and everyone will become much more obvious to everybody what they're really up to, which is replacing human decision making with AI. Because the humans cannot make the decisions in such a horrific fashion and a manner. So, for example, to mass murder civilians in Gaza, what we've seen is all sorts of AI being deployed by the Israelis to make decisions about who's going to get killed, where and when. And I think this is going to be spread out. And this is one of the reasons why it seems to me the banksters have got a lot to answer for here, because they're the people who are funding this AI bubble to the tune of around about $1 trillion annually in research and development for AI. So if you want to get a job in Britain today, you can go and get a job training the AI to get better and better at making decisions, taking those decisions away from people and putting them in the hands of machines. And of course, it's not just the machine making the decision. People like Elon Musk will be steering and controlling the algorithms. So that machine will be doing their will. And it's really just a way of spreading their power out through whatever systems are now replacing democracy. But there's another whole dimension to this, right, which is the spiritual dimension, this idea of the mark of the beast. And we had what was his name? Conrad Flynn, being interviewed by Tucker Carlson recently, spending an hour and a half, 2 hours or so going into the influence of the occult and how do we avoid the mark of the beast. Now, I think this is really prompted by Starmer. The Americans keep quite a close eye on British politics, rolling this out with the left-wing government here in Britain, saying, we're going to just do this. And so the Americans are thinking, really? This looks like China to me. What are you up to in Britain? And the freedoms are all being thrown away. So he gets into this whole concept of the mark of the beast in the book of Revelation at the end of the New Testament. And there is a battle over this book of Revelation, obviously between people that think it's nonsense and rubbish and just made up, but also between the occultists who say, this is our plan. We're just going to do this because this is the way we're going to win. And they paint themselves as the good guys in the book of Revelation. Plus, there are all sorts of spiritual people, maybe from the Abrahamic faith, that see this scenario, the Antichrist and all these things in the Revelation book, including the mark of the beast, this thing which you have to have in your body. I think it's in your hand or on your forehead. And I'm thinking maybe the hand thing is going to be for the worker bees and the forehead is going to be for the elite. That seems to be a way of literally controlling people through finance. So if you don't do as you're told, as in the Chinese social credit system, you start to lose your rights as a human. You start to lose your rights to have money and what you can spend your money on. And I don't know how that's been going in China, but clearly this is a system of complete and utter control.
Well, I'm glad you've raised that, because the couple of things that were obviously connecting and coming up in my mind were the push for digital currency, which is a reality. Central, digital currency is a thing. And of course, crypto is there. Clive's quite positive about some of that side as well. But I'm concerned that this kind of centralization and the state working with these transnational corporations, Larry Fink and State Street and JP Morgan, whoever they are now. I mean, some of them are there, some have gone, but they all seem to be a gang that constantly, the names pop up, Bank of America, and Merrill Lynch. The same names keep popping up. The same names are behind the bulk of the corporate funding of most companies around the world. The same names are operating in China, the same names are operating in the US, and Britain is not bereft of guilt, because the City of London is probably the driving heart of all of that, the beating heart. So arguably, some people say that power's never left Britain, it's still there. So what do you make of this entire edifice of, and you've raised this idea of a sort of cultish, sort of almost satanic or a kind of an otherworldly connection, almost the sort of thing that we'd often put towards, I guess, the occult, really, and we'd relegate it as something that's irrelevant. But
well, I think in Britain we do have an occult in the background. If you look at the history, I would thoroughly recommend Margaret Murray's books about one of them. The first one, Margaret Murray's an anthropologist, and she was writing in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and she wrote a book called The Witch Cult in Western Europe, which showed the continuity of this hidden activity behind the scenes in witchcraft right the way back hundreds of years in Europe, and being battled with by the Vatican, but originally the Orthodox Church, then the Protestant Church, Henry VIII, the witch burnings after the introduction of the Church of England, this kind of thing, and all sorts of injustices that took place, probably some justice too. But then her second book, The God of the Witches, is also really interesting, because you can see that there are specific methods of organising around witchcraft which keep everything very quiet, very similar in a way to, in fact, some of the oaths are similar to Freemasonry.
Like secret societies.
Well, the idea is a small group of people, 13, with one in charge, whether that be the master of the lodge or the high priest of the coven, and those high priests are all part of higher, so say from 13 covens are all part of a priest from a higher coven. Now, where do these people hide in the City of London, right? Clearly, to me, I see them in the two things. One is the livery companies. So these are the medieval guilds, very, very closely kept secrets in those guilds. That Masons, of course, were one of those guilds. And then also the orders of knighthood. So things like the Order of Teutonic Knights in Germany, the Order of the Garter here in Britain, which surrounds the monarch and the heir to the throne at Windsor Castle, which Prince Andrew has just been booted out from. So these, I think, are the areas where these people hang out, and they use this, I think, as quite a powerful method of secret control. None of this stuff is talked about in the press, because many of the people involved in this are the press. So that's, I think, one of the methods of control that's used. The occult is basically means hidden. So the idea is these people feel they can act with impunity, because not only have they got powerful players within their occult circle, but nobody knows what they're talking about, and they swear blood oaths. And let's just. This what it means is that if they speak outside the lodge about it, that the lodge has the right to kill them. So these are expressly forbidden in the New Testament by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, never swear an oath. right? Simply let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything else comes from the devil. And all those people have put themselves outside that system where they're swearing oaths of loyalty to a small group of people. And many of them, of course, are in public office. They should never be in public office.
This is an entire topic of research that we're going to have to revisit this in an entire new program. And but it links to this idea of people who want control, who want power. And for them, this godsend of technology, modern AI, and all the information technology they have at their disposal, of course, they're licking their lips. And Clive, whilst you gave us hope that actually they will self-detonate and it won't work, they're going to have a damn good go trying, aren't they? Because what frightens me, I guess, if anything does frighten me, I'm probably not frightened. I'm just like concerned that a sleeping public, if it was accosted with, for instance, digital currency, and basically they were locked in to a system where there was no more cash, for instance, and if they were reliant entirely on a universal wage, which was going to come from this central funding controlled by the government, but backed by the likes of the WEF or the corporates, then if somebody fell foul of that system, that's an extraordinary power, because they would literally have their lifeline cut off. And I've seen it actually practically now. I've seen videos in China of young people, at various ages actually, sleeping rough, out of work, out of the system, because they can't enter their WeChat, they can't enter any of their access to their bank, their funds, their accounts. They're not allowed to get work, so they basically end up being this kind of redundant crowd. Why? Because they said something on a social media site, or they didn't hit the targets at work, perhaps, or they failed to comply with government diktat on one rule, regulation or other in a very totalitarian system. That bothers me. I mean, do you think that there's any chance that could actually take hold here in the West? I mean, it's bad enough with neoliberalism and neoconservatism, but one thing we've always liked is the idea that we can speak and we can have discussions and debates and we can fight the system. That kind of draconian totalitarianism seems far more worrying to me.
Well, the reality is that we're already there. We've been there for some time. And you've got people posting on social media and then getting a visit from the police and being arrested.
And Britain is the biggest arrester of such people. It's got the track record, it's got the reputation of having the most detainees.
But the thing is, there are several points that need to be understood. First and foremost, most of what is talked about in terms of digital currency or digital ID, we already have. We're already subjected to severe restrictions. I had personal experience because I don't use credit cards. I only have debit cards. I can't buy anything for which you have to prove your age, which seems crazy. But leaving that aside, let's talk about AI and what it is. The current generations of AI, in terms of what the public have access to, ChatGPT and the like, are large language models. And basically, they're trawling the internet and looking for patterns and giving responses based on those patterns. But in order for AI to progress, and it's progressing very quickly, we're now getting into agentic AI, where you have, if you like, specialized AI modules to do certain tasks, to actually bring the problems closer to or the solutions closer to where the problems arise. And the other very important thing to understand is that we are spiritual beings. We have feelings, we are conscious, we are connected to the universe spiritually and energetically. Consciousness is not data. So whatever one talks about in terms of AI becoming sentient, conscious entity, unless it's fused with a human entity, that is just not going to happen. And obviously there are ambitions to do that. But there are many dimensions to this to do with the way we as society think, because we as in the West are very much left-brained orientated, whereas in the East they're much more if you like, rake brain and much more contextual. So we've been following a linear path to, if you like, tragedy or disaster. But there is a consciousness that is rising amongst people that is actually awakening to the dangers of everything that has been described eloquently by Tanya and yourself. That means that they're not going to be able to enact what they're trying to enact. So if you take, I referred earlier to the whole sort of centralized concept. One of the problems with centralizing AI and all of these things is the huge energy costs. The only way it is practical for these large platforms to actually develop their AI successfully to be even better than it is now is to use nearline storage, local processing, distributed engines, if you like, or algorithms that actually learn for themselves from experience. So I wrote many years ago when the critical thinking project was in full throw, I don't know, about 10 years ago, I postulated that given the methodology we use to sort of distill all the available information down into a sort of understandable narrative or model, I postulated that if AI was given free rein to analyze all the information that we'd come across, would it arrive at the same conclusions? And I think having, with myself and colleagues, interacted with AI and posed questions and put information to it, it is actually learning about an alternative narrative, if you like. So, however, these things are tools. It's like the occult. The occult, since it, as Stanley says, simply means hidden. But this knowledge dates back millennia, and there is a lot of ancient knowledge and wisdom which they have been trying to use against us. But if you actually understand hermeticism and esoteric knowledge, basically these techniques that they use are the most powerful when they're used in the name of love and the universe, because the universe runs on love. But if you can call it satanic, the devil, evil, whatever. It's basically a selfishness to be gods on earth. And they will fail because the universe is much stronger than they are. Good will always overcome evil in the end. And so, however hard they are trying, they are going to fail. And the way they will fail is because more and more people are experiencing a rising consciousness. They are detaching themselves from this human farm in every way that they can, some people more than others, because everybody has their own circumstances and limitations. But the more you detach from the system, the more you realize that the future is actually here. But as long as you keep feeding this machine by paying taxes and all the rest of it and complying with their criminal legal code, for want of a better way of putting it, which has nothing to do with lawfulness, the more you detach, the more this stuff doesn't need to affect you. And the way to stop the genocide in Gaza and all of the things that are going on in the world is to defund and basically take our power and resources away from the organs that are actually promoting all this, which is government, corporations.
Apart from what Clive says in terms of dissent and taking away their power in that sense, what are other practical ways on the ground that you see people could really live in the interim period during this struggle of changing over? Because between the period of like a new system arriving and the old one dying, there is a struggle. And how do people navigate real life, paying bills, keeping their families surviving, and getting to the next stage, which is what Clive is saying is going to be a future where they are in control, the ordinary public, but which I probably think actually is optimistic. Personally, I think that there's going to be a much bigger struggle, and the powers that be have the ability to actually, you remember the kid when you were youngsters, and the kid who had the football, when you tried to do things democratically, and if it wasn't going his way, he'd grab the ball and go off home. is worst case scenario. Well, they've got the ball and they can take it home, or they can cause pandemonium and mayhem and shut the game down. Where do you think the pendulum's going?
Well, I don't think they've quite got the ball. Yeah, so they're wrestling for control of the ball, but there is still, I think, struggle going on. Now, let's look at what you're saying is you're talking about here about the cost of living crisis, struggling to pay bills, because we're now living in a fascist, monopolistic country where the major industries that used to be thought of as our infrastructure are owned by the likes of BlackRock. The gas infrastructure is owned by China. And these people know that we need these things, whether it be transport, electricity, water, and so they can just jack the price up. It's called price fixing. That's what they're doing. And so people are being driven further and further away from having money to spend, to having disposable income. Look, let's be quite clear about this. The financial system is going to crash. We've had this discussion for many years. Every once in a while, Jamie Dimon or Larry Fink or somebody will talk about, well, the stock market is a bit overblown at the moment. Particularly AI shares are massively. Some of these AI companies haven't even had any revenue. So you imagine you've got a massive stock price all on tick for something that might happen.
Bubble will burst.
Well, it might happen in the future. So when it does, they are prepared. They've got their digital currencies. They've got the central bank digital currencies. They've got other currencies, the programmable money, all ready to go. So they're saying, oh, well, that system was no good and it didn't work and it caused a terrible crisis. We've got a nice new system. And so that's where I think there's, and I love it when actually Clive talks about farming people farms. I see many British cities now as people farms. I think, in the Industrial Revolution, people, I suppose a Marxist view would say that's what they were back in the Industrial Revolution. But we've now got, right across Britain and in many parts of the Western world, we've got urban areas which were created to manufacture for the past industrial years, which have now lost their purpose of being there. So they're effectively like almost becoming like urban prisons. What people how did we get here? Well, we got here because people have been made landless. Millions and millions, something like 80, 90% of the population doesn't have anywhere where they are allowed to stay. And this goes back to what you were saying about China and here homelessness on the streets of London. This is sending out a very clear signal to the rest of the population. I think it was Tony Benn that pointed this out, the British Labour MP, that they are disciplining everybody else. So as you walk past a homeless person, whether it's in China or here in London, you're thinking, oh, I better make sure I do what my boss says tomorrow and I don't lose my job, because otherwise I could end up like that.
Like him.
It's very, very clear social control going on. So that's why I think the powers that be do this sort of thing. But they are most definitely chasing the people, I think, towards this idea of being completely money dependent. That's why I think you're seeing, for example, large amounts in London here. If somebody dies, it's almost impossible for them to pass their home on to their children anymore. Now, remember, they have paid massive amounts of tax in order to buy that home. But then when they die, no, we're going to take 40% of that value of that £1 million or $1.5 million.
Is now about to impose even more wealth tax one way or another.
Well, those taxes are not imposed on corporations because they don't die. They carry on and on and on. But people are being hit with these sorts of taxes to take all of the wealth out of the family so they become dependent on money. So first of all, people were evicted from the land. Everyone had a place to live. If you go back to medieval times, it was understood, even the poor. Well, there's a piece of land for them. They can graze their cow on there. It was called, actually, in medieval England, in the old open field villages, it was called the dole, the area of the village where people who had nothing could stay and they could graze their cattle or whatever few animals they had, they could keep them there, geese or whatever. And so now in modern parlance in Britain, that means the money that the government, you're on the dole, the money that the government gives you when you don't have a job. Right. So in a way, it's the same thing. So that whole dependence on, and remember, of course, the earth is a common treasury for all, right? You can't really own it. You can you can be a steward of it, but officially you can, in law, you can own it. But I don't think really anybody owns the earth. Who owns? Oh, yes, I own it. Well, Larry Fink thinks he owns it, but really does he? So we've had this thing we're all dependent on, we all need taken away. And we've now been made dependent on the money, the financial system, and now we're having that taken away as well. Now, that really is a route to slavery.
So what would be your dream? Because Larry Fink and co have given their dream, I think, what they're selling their dream and they're pushing it and they're getting governments to try and implement it. What would you say is a good dream?
Okay, so I work with some great friends in Luton, Exodus Collective, back in the 1990s and noughties. And their motto, they were a three-party sound system. Now, this is in the era of what they call the Criminal Justice Act, where the Conservative government of John Major was clamping down on the raves. So there were raves being set up all around the country, in the countryside overnight, usually out in the woods in the middle of nowhere. And thousands of people, it was when the first days of mobile phones, you get a text, come here. And you would have a great night out partying in the middle of nowhere, in a wood somewhere. And so this was all clamped down on by the major government and the criminal justice. There was a massive march in London, which the far-right football crowd were brought in to destabilise the march. So the police were playing naughty. They were deliberately, agent provocateurs, bringing them into the march. But anyway, the Exodus Collective had a lovely phrase, disconnect from Babylon. Disconnect from Babylon. I said, don't be dependent on the system. Find your own way somewhere, whether it's through a small business. Loads of people, by the way, now in Bristol, we've got over 800 people living in vehicles, living in caravans, living in vans, because they've decided this is insane. How can I pay £2,500 a month rent for this little house here, or for a flat I'm living in? I can't do it. And so they've decided to either get into a canal boat, a barge, or into a vehicle. So I think that's my message to your viewers, is find a way to disconnect from that system, because that system is sending you into a slavery type system, even though you may even enjoy your job. We're finding now through, if you go to employment agency surveys, they're saying something like 75 or 80% of employees, when asked, would rather have another different job. They don't like their job. They're getting up in the morning, doing something they don't enjoy. So disconnect.
Well, good. And final word comes from you, Clive. The dream. Where do you recommend people go from here?
I think Tony is exactly right. Everybody has their own unique circumstances, and not everybody can do the same thing in terms of disconnecting, say, as much as I have. But it starts in stages. It's doing away with loyalty cards. It's an attitudinal thing where you cease to worry about how much money you have and actually work on doing as much as you can without money. So entertainment, food, health, all of these things, there are a growing number of networks where you can explore how to enjoy a much fuller life without using money. So instead of going to a corporate entertainment, there's music happening in festivals, little local festivals, little communities. There is a lot of vibrancy at the grassroots level. And at the same time, the structure is changing, adapting to this new world, which basically, it is a game. We're in a game of life, the rules of which are much like Monopoly. It's all running on money. The rules of the game are now changing, and the money will become less and less important. So the more that you can disassociate yourself from the money system, not paying for things, there are law groups that show you how to quite lawfully, in the true universal sense, not pay council tax because it's a criminal activity, not least because it's funding wars and organ trafficking and all sorts of other things. So you disassociate as much as you can and embrace what this new paradigm has to offer, which is based on love, community, relationships, looking after each other. The overriding principle of the universe is love thy neighbor as thyself, because we're all connected. We're all part of universal consciousness. We are transforming from nations into a global village. But it's not going to happen at a government level or a council level. It's going to happen amongst groups, distributed, autonomous, codependent, self-organizing groups. That's where the future lies. That is the process that created all these wonderful bits of technology that we carry around with us, the internet and all the rest of it. It's that same process. When we open source value in the way that we've open source software development, then the world will be in a completely different place. And the quicker that one adapts to that, the sooner that future arrives.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tony Gosling. Thank you, Clive, for a fascinating journey and also a vision. It's very rare that people give the alternative, but it's not absolutely necessary that we have to remain enslaved to the system. The whole concepts around mortgages, you know, the death grip that we've been used to, certainly for the last 70, 80 years, or nearly that much, is over. Because they don't even want to give you a house. You can't get into their death grip anymore. They don't want to give you any mortgage. They don't want you in their death grip. They want something else. What do you want? The question is not about following exactly what systems tell you and blindly following those because you haven't been given the powers of critical thinking, or because you've decided to give up your imagination, or you decided to give up your dream at some point in that process, whether it was at school or beyond. The truth is you've still got control. You have agency. You have the ability to make choices as to what you want to do. My two guests today have given some very clear ideas of what that dream was. I'm very aware of something called the prophetic dream from an Islamic point of view in the East and in that part of the world. You know, the dream was very similar to what my friends have talked about. It was the dream of really giving people genuine inner and outer freedom. But that comes, first of all, with controlling your ego, controlling your desires, controlling that materialism, which actually they've been using in this kind of system that we've lived in, the capitalist system, to make you want more and more and more. You know, hence your Primarks and hence the constant production of new clothes, cheap clothes that you throw away. It's that kind of mentality and culture which you control and I can control. They don't necessarily have.
Can I just give a word,
Please, Tony,
a word of warning? Though?
Yes.
Because quite clearly the other side is losing the battle for hearts and minds. I think people around, particularly around the Western world, in Europe and the United States, are starting to figure out what they're up to. However much they control the media, people are switching off their TVs. So be aware that they are planning a financial crash. So when that, don't lose heart, expect it. This is a sign that what they're up to. The other thing, of course, is war. They are planning war. They want chaos, as much chaos as possible, so that their nice man can come and sort everything out in the future. So I would also just like to plug this little section in the book of Revelation about the four horsemen of the apocalypse, because I think this is sent down through time to warn us when these events start happening, when financial crash, when war, when pestilence starts happening, and famine, exactly, then this is a sign actually from God that this was all preordained. Yeah. Stick with the faith and stick with it right to the end. So there is this, I think, you know, as a caveat, because it's not going to be easy to get through all this. It's like the birth pangs of heaven are not going to be pleasant. Very important points there. And it made me think that perhaps because the West is still perhaps educated, liberated enough, or has had a taste of liberation, that it is the front line in terms of the attack. And hence we're seeing the destruction of the West, as far as I can see. There's a deliberate economic, social and cultural attack and destruction by the powers that be, and that's why we're seeing most of this fragmentation. We could carry on theorizing. We've given you enough to think about for this show. Thank you very much to my guests once again. Thank you, Clive, and thank you, Tony. And until the next deep dive perspective, please don't forget to hit that like, share, and thanking button, subscription button. We rely on your support because we are the independent media. We are fighting the system. The legacy media is not going to tell you these things, and without
without us being here to be able to educate youngsters, educate those who really need an alternative dream, an alternative vision, we're much less likely to be able to inspire that kind of resistance or that revolution for a far better world. And that's our purpose, ultimately. Thank you very much.